What makes a young generation dare to trade blood and freedom to rewrite the destiny of an entire nation? Freedom and rebellion. From a ban to a rebellion. When the Nepalese government announced a ban on social media platforms, the reasons given sounded reasonable at first glance: to control fake news, fake accounts, harmful content. Yet, the social effect turned out to be the exact opposite. For millions of young people, especially Generation Z, that ban was not just an administrative measure. It was a direct violation of what lies at the core of modern life: the right to communicate, to share, to exist in the digital public space. Here, we begin to touch on a philosophical problem. What is freedom? Is freedom simply the absence of control, or is it the ability to participate in social life as a subject? That ban reveals a deep conflict between a paternalistic state, accustomed to imposing, and a new generation raised in a globalized context, who see the internet as the heir of freedom. The rebellion in Nepal, therefore, is not just a sudden outburst. It is a living philosophical expression of a society when freedom is threatened. Freedom from philosophical tradition to the reality of Nepal. The concept of freedom has been at the center of Western political philosophy for centuries. For Kant, freedom is not simply doing whatever one wants. Freedom is the capacity to act according to practical reason. That is, the ability to legislate for oneself, a universal moral law. A free person is not someone indulgent, but someone capable of self-mastery through reason. Hegel went further. Freedom only has meaning when realized in social life, in an objective spirit. No one is free in isolation. We are only free when we live in a legal moral community that guarantees mutual recognition. Isaiah Berlin later distinguished between negative freedom, not being hindered, no external barriers, and positive freedom, the ability to master oneself, to decide one's own life. Through Berlin's lens, we can see clearly in Nepal, the social media ban is precisely the deprivation of negative freedom, the prohibition of a means of communication. But beyond that lies something deeper. It also obstructs positive freedom, for the young generation is no longer able to participate in the public forum, no longer able to create meaning for their community. Therefore, their response is not merely anger at an app being blocked. It is a response to the denial of human subjectivity in the digital age, rebellion as an act of affirming freedom. Here, we recall Albert Camus in The Rebel, L'Homme Révolté. Camus said, "Man rebels not only because he wants to overthrow oppression, but more deeply because he wants to affirm a limit. I rebel, therefore I affirm that there is something that cannot be accepted." In Nepal's context, young people are telling the authorities, "You may impose laws, but you have no right to silence my voice." Rebellion, in Camus' sense, is not aimless destruction. It is the affirmation that human beings cannot be reduced to tools, cannot be governed as mute entities. What is interesting is that Camus emphasized, rebellion is the starting act of political consciousness. When a young generation takes to the streets en masse, they are not merely opposing an administrative decision. They are doing what Camus called turning a negation into an affirmation, from saying no to repression to saying yes to a new form of community, a different social horizon, Gen Z, and freedom as public space. If previous generations understood freedom mainly through the individual lens, voting rights, freedom of speech, property rights, then Gen Z grew up in the social media environment where freedom is synonymous with being present in a digital public space. Here we may recall Jürgen Habermas and the concept of the public sphere. Habermas described it as a place where citizens gather, discuss, form public opinion, and from there exert pressure on political power. In the past, the public sphere was cafes, newspapers, assembly halls. Today, for Gen Z, it is Facebook, TikTok, YouTube. Banning social media is therefore not just cutting off entertainment. It is shutting down the parliament of the younger generation. That is exactly why outrage erupted so strongly. Rebellion became the only way to reclaim a public space that had been seized. The clash between two concepts of freedom. The Nepalese rebellion also shows a collision between two conceptions of freedom. Freedom in the sense of state guardianship. The government claims to protect citizens from misinformation. This is a paternalistic logic. I know what is good for you. Freedom in the sense of subjectivity. The younger generation asserts they have the right to decide for themselves what information is true or false, the right to try, error, learn in an open environment. Political philosophy has always asked, who is qualified to decide what is good for society? Here, the state assumes that right, but the younger generation rejects it. This situation recalls John Stuart Mill, who once wrote in On Liberty, "Truth can only emerge in a free environment of debate. Any censorship, even with good intentions, impoverishes the intellect. Freedom as coexistence." One point must not be overlooked. Freedom is never just an individual matter. It is always intersubjective between subjects. In Nepal, young people took to the streets not because each individual suffered direct economic harm. They marched because they realized the whole community had been stripped of a shared space of existence. That is precisely the expansion of the concept of freedom, from I to we. Here, Hannah Arendt's philosophy is very useful. Arendt emphasized that politics begins when people act together, acting in concert. Freedom, for Arendt, is not an inner state, but the experience of collective action in a space where we can appear as someone before others. The Nepalese rebellion embodied this notion when thousands of youths chanted together, built barricades together, faced the police together. They were not merely resisting. They were creating a common world where freedom exists through collective action, connecting with the tradition of rebellion in history. Viewed broadly, we can see Nepal's event as a continuation of a rebellious tradition tied to the yearning for freedom. In 1789, the French stormed the Bastille, not just because it was a prison, but because it was a symbol of oppression. In 1968, Parisian students took to the streets because they wanted to break the bonds of a conservative society. In 2011, the Arab Spring ignited in Tunisia also from a seemingly small event, a street vendor's self-immolation, but it awakened an entire repressed desire for freedom. Nepal 2025 is the same. A social media ban became the spark for a revolution of consciousness. Viewed through philosophy, we see that rebellion arises not only from material suffering, but from the insult to the dignity of human freedom. Freedom, rebellion, and tragedy. However, it must be stated clearly. Rebellion is not only tinged with romance, it is also full of tragedy. More than 20 people have died, hundreds injured, many buildings burned down. Here, philosophy asks, can freedom be born from violence, or must it always be paid for with blood? Camus once warned, rebellion easily slides into blind violence if it loses its humanist core. Rebellion must preserve human dignity, otherwise it will become the very thing it opposes. The philosophical lesson in Nepal, therefore, is freedom always requires vigilance, so as not to be devoured by its own rage. From Nepal, we can see clearly, freedom is not an abstract concept, but a living experience. Rebellion is a philosophical act, affirming that there are limits to power that cannot be crossed. Gen Z, by taking to the streets, have redefined freedom as presence in both digital and physical public space, as the ability to act together to affirm dignity. Thus, freedom and rebellion in Nepal are not just political matters, but a philosophical message. Human beings in any era will rise when freedom is suffocated, because freedom is not just a right, but the very essence of our existence. Power, corruption, and political crisis. If the first part focused on freedom and rebellion as a philosophical response to oppression, then in this part, we need to look deeper into the roots of why that rebellion erupted so fiercely. The crisis of political power, fueled by corruption, dynastic rule, and the collapse of legitimacy. In Nepal, the social media ban was only the last straw. Behind the anger of the young generation lie decades of frustration with a decayed power structure. The government used the excuse of maintaining order, but in the eyes of the people, it symbolized a system detached from reality, incapable of representing common aspirations. The question that arises here is, what is political power? Why does it so easily degenerate into corruption? And why does the loss of trust inevitably lead to rebellion? According to Max Weber, political power can only endure when it rests on some form of legitimacy, that is, being recognized by those who are ruled. Weber distinguished three types of legitimacy: traditional, legal rational, and charismatic. For decades, Nepal operated on a mixture, relying on dynastic traditions, on the formal legality of elections, and at times on the image of a leader. But once these foundations waver, when the people no longer believe in that legitimacy, power is stripped bare as sheer coercion. At that point, rebellion becomes an unavoidable reaction. Michel Foucault gives us a different perspective. Power, he argued, is not only in the hands of government or police, but dispersed throughout society, in discourses, in how knowledge is produced and imposed. When a state bans social media, it is not only blocking a tool, but attempting to control discourse, deciding who has the right to speak, who has the right to listen, what counts as truth. But Foucault also pointed out, where there is power, there is resistance. The explosion of Nepalese youth is proof of this logic. The more they are silenced, the louder the scream echoes. Corruption, in a deeper sense, is not only about officials pocketing public money. Corruption is when a system of power ceases to serve the common good and turns instead to serving the private interests of the ruling elite. This is what Rousseau warned of in The Social Contract. The state is legitimate only when it embodies the general will. When it betrays the general will, that contract is broken, and the people have the right to rebel to establish a new order. In this light, we understand why Nepal's Gen Z sees their resistance not merely as personal anger, but as an act of restoring the social contract torn apart by the state. John Locke, in the 17th century, also wrote that people form governments to protect natural rights, the right to life, liberty, and property. When governments destroy those foundations, the people not only have the right, but the duty to rise against them. This explains why the deaths of dozens during the rebellion did not cause the movement to falter, but on the contrary, made it more legitimate in the eyes of its participants. The blood spilled in Kathmandu is not only a tragedy, but a symbol of a society reclaiming what was stolen. Marx, of course, offered a different explanation. For him, all political power is ultimately a tool of the ruling class. Corruption and dynastic rule in Nepal can be seen as expressions of the elite maintaining privilege while the majority are excluded. When class contradictions accumulate, eruption is inevitable. What is particular in Nepal is that the vanguard of rebellion is not workers or peasants, as Marx imagined, but Gen Z, a globalized generation, connected through social media, strongly aware of injustice but not bound by traditional structures. One could say they are a new historical subject, different from Marx's projection, but acting according to the same logic, resisting the monopoly of a powerful minority. In this picture, the political crisis in Nepal is not just a local event. It is evidence of a universal paradox. Power, created to maintain order and justice, easily degenerates into an instrument of oppression and corruption. When that happens, rebellion becomes the only means to re-establish legitimacy. But rebellion is not meaningless destruction. It is the renegotiation of the social contract, the way a new generation forces the state to listen. From a philosophical perspective, we see that power cannot be maintained by force or law alone. It requires trust, recognition, consensus. A corrupt, opaque, unjust state will sooner or later lose that trust. And when trust collapses, then even with armies, guns, and armored vehicles, that power becomes fragile before unarmed hands carrying collective will. Nepal is reliving an ancient truth. No power endures if it does not arise from the consent of the people. Therefore, the events in Nepal are not just a short-term political crisis. They are a vivid illustration of a philosophical problem. Power cannot be separated from legitimacy, and when legitimacy is eroded by corruption and dynastic rule, rebellion becomes the way people restore justice. What Gen Z is doing is not dismantling society, but forcing society to be rebuilt on a cleaner and more just foundation. The future of society and the philosophical meaning of the rebellion. If the first part showed rebellion as the call of freedom and the second exposed the crisis of power and legitimacy, then the final part must turn to a bigger question. After violence, bloodshed, and the collapse of trust, what is the future of Nepalese society, and what universal philosophical meaning can we draw from this rebellion? Tragedy always accompanies freedom. Those who fell in the rebellion in Kathmandu are not only victims, they are symbols of the clash between the longing to live authentically and a system no longer capable of listening. Nietzsche once wrote that, from tragedy, we learn to say yes to life. That is, even in loss, there is a power that affirms life. The rebellion in Nepal, in this light, is not merely a negative reaction against the state, but an act of affirmation. This society can be different, must be different, and the young generation is willing to pay the price to open that possibility. Walter Benjamin once said that every uprising of the oppressed is an interruption of official history. It breaks the linearity imposed by the state to open the chance of rewriting history from the side of the silenced. Today's Nepal is precisely such a moment. Gen Z refuses to live as the previous generation did. They want interruption. They want to break the cycle of corruption and dynastic rule to rewrite the collective story according to a new order. In that perspective, Hannah Arendt provides an important key. She argued that real power does not lie in violence, but in the capacity of people to act together, to create a common space where each individual appears as someone, with a voice, with an action. Nepal is witnessing this. The gatherings in the streets, the resonance on digital platforms, even though banned, yet the more they are banned, the more they explode through VPNs, through new channels, all show that real power is shifting from the official government to the rebellious community. In that chorus, a new form of power is being born, the power Arendt called constituent power, the capacity to establish a new political order. Nepal's future can thus take many paths. One possibility is that the state crushes dissent with total violence, plunging society into a dark spiral. But there is also another possibility, one history has often witnessed, that from blood and tears will arise a new order, not because the state bestows it, but because the people have forced it through their sacrifice. Here, philosophy reminds us, freedom and justice are never granted. They are always seized in historical moments where people dare to wager their very lives to affirm dignity. The universal meaning of Nepal's rebellion does not lie in it occurring in a small Himalayan nation, but in the fact that it reflects a global crisis of democracies, the rise of corruption, the weakening of trust in institutions, the discontent of the young generation with outdated systems. When social media becomes the new public space, every effort to control it with violence only reveals the crisis of legitimacy in government. This is true not only in Nepal, but resonates elsewhere, from the Middle East, South America, even to long-standing Western democracies. From a philosophical view, the Nepalese rebellion reminds us that history is not a straight line of progress, but always contains shocks, uprisings, moments when a community decides to stop and redefine itself. It is precisely in such moments that philosophy of freedom, justice, and community is rewritten, not on paper, but with sweat, blood, and tears. And then comes the final question philosophy must face. Does rebellion truly open a better society, or does it merely repeat the cycle of new power, replacing old power? This is a constant fear. Camus warned, rebellion can turn into dictatorship if it loses its humanist core. Arendt reminds us that only collective action in a spirit of respecting difference can sustain freedom. Therefore, the lesson for Nepal and for humanity is, rebellion has true philosophical meaning only when it does not stop at destruction, but continues toward creation of a space where each person may appear as a subject. The future of Nepal cannot yet be foretold, but one thing is certain. Their Gen Z has sent a message to the world that the young will no longer endure in silence, that freedom cannot be blocked by firewalls, and that when the social contract is betrayed, rebellion becomes the last but inevitable way to restore justice. In their chants, we hear the echo of history. Human beings, wherever they are, will rise when dignity is insulted. That is the eternal philosophical message the Nepalese rebellion leaves for humanity. If you are interested in philosophical reflections on freedom, power, and social upheaval, leave your thoughts in the comments and don't forget to follow to continue this dialogue.